This paper, Factors Related to Northern Goshawk Landscape Use in the Western Great Lakes Area, caught my eye. For one, I live in Marquette, Michigan, which is in this region. And it was just a very clever use of LANDFIRE data. So for GIS people, this approach I'm sure is very common, but basically using plot data on northern goshawks, they developed sort of a rule set for habitat use, sort of almost these if-then statements, if you will, like if canopy cover is this much, if the base canopy height is this much, if we have this ecosystem, then we might have northern goshawks. So basically they stacked together, that would be the technical term in R if you're doing your GIS work in R, or did a combine in ArcMap. And they took basically LANDFIRE existing vegetation type, LANDFIRE succession class data, and canopy base height data from LANDFIRE, and basically mapped out northern goshawk landscape use. So I just thought it was really cool. Another paper I wanted to point out is called Drivers and Consequences of Alternative Landscape Features on Wildlife Distributions in New England, United States. What they did here was they basically did sort of collaborative modeling with stakeholders to explore different futures and how those different futures in New England would impact wildlife habitat. And so what they used LANDFIRE for was basically to identify the riparian areas. So that's all they did. LANDFIRE was one of probably a dozen input data sets to their work. And I think this is really common and clever. They reviewed several data sets and found that for their part of the world, for their questions, LANDFIRE data was the best to extract that riparian area from. So we see that a lot where LANDFIRE data is one of many and they pull out the best, leave the rest, and kind of mash data sets together to get at the attributes they're looking for. Another paper that caught my eye recently was this one by Burdett et al. And it was looking at pumas, which I thought was cool. And I'm gonna actually do Control F and scroll down to their LANDFIRE use, and I'll zoom in a little bit. So basically, they did something that I think is super important. And Joe, I believe you guys did some of this with your beaver mapping tools. They basically found that the LANDFIRE existing vegetation type data was useful, but it was too fine-grained, meaning, you know, they might have 7 northern hardwood types in their legend. Okay, not for pumas, not for this area, that was a bad example, but they might have multiple ponderosa pine forest types mapped by LANDFIRE and the existing vegetation type data set, and they might lump all those together into one ponderosa pine type. They actually combined probably dozens of existing vegetation types into 10 vegetation classes. And this is a super effective way to take LANDFIRE data and to make it more appropriate for your landscape. So we see people do this a fair bit, and it really makes the data work better. We deliver it, you know, it comes out as is, and if it's fine-grained, we figure people can lump it back together or reclassify it. If we just delivered kind of broad or coarse data sets, then it would be hard to split it out. So we see this a fair bit. Another thing we see a fair bit would be people like Shoemaker et al. Extracting out bits of LANDFIRE data, almost like the riparian example that I mentioned before, which will basically just in GIS, you know, extract by attribute would be the actual tool you would use. Extract by attribute and pull out the ecosystems you care about, or the canopy cover ranges you care about if you're looking at LANDFIRE existing vegetation cover, or whatever the case may be, and just, you know, making that the data set you work with. Here they're using a machine learning approach to look at, I think it was mule deer. So tons of LANDFIRE data uses in the wildlife habitat world. And what I'm happy to see is people becoming more sophisticated, people doing more review, people working with the data to make it fit their questions. And that's what caught my eye initially about the work on the beaver restoration assessment tool. The first paper I saw by the Eco-Geomorphology and Topographic Analysis Laboratory, including Joe Wheaton, who's on the call today. What caught my eye is that they had done review of LANDFIRE data. They had used their expertise, plot data, to understand LANDFIRE data, the strengths and weaknesses of the two data sets, if I remember this right, Joe, that you guys use the most, which would be LANDFIRE biophysical settings that represent the historical ecosystems and existing vegetation cover, or excuse me, type, which maps nature serves ecological systems on the ground today. So they used those two data sets and they reviewed them, and they made their products better by understanding the data. I'm seeing more and more of that. I'm also seeing more and more of the reclassification, which I believe they also do. So, in your lunch hour, when you're having a beverage, go check out the Beaver Restoration Assessment tool. There's so much here, so much data, so many ways to explore the riparian areas of the West, including one of my favorites. They deliver a KML file that has several attributes to it, but you can bring it into Google Earth. You don't even need ArcMap or anything like that. You can bring it in, zoom out, start to explore a landscape. So here I have the sort of existing capacity, and you can see the legend over on the left, for an area sort of near where Megan lives, west of Reno. So I want to just call this out. There are multiple things that went into this tool. It's not just LANDFIRE data. But again, I just appreciate the work they did because of the review and the reclassification they did. They didn't just, plop LANDFIRE data in here without review or without understanding it. And I think that's super important. We do our best to be accurate, to develop useful products for people. But with all, we're labeling over 9 billion pixels in the lower 48 with dozens of attributes. So it behooves all of us for people to review the data. And I got a note from Joe the other day asking if we could talk about the biophysical settings data, because they have some ideas of how it might be tweaked for their area. So hopefully, Joe, we can talk about that and figure out ways that we can help make the data better. We're always looking for chances for that. So with that, I'm at about 10 minutes. And what I like to do is stop sharing. I'll look at the chat. And I see Bloody Mary's anyone is the first question I see. But with that, I want to just open the floor for questions about anything that I've presented or anything LANDFIRE. It doesn't have to be about wildlife. Again, we're just doing that to do a bit of a demo and to prime the pump a little bit. But with that, I'm going to open it up for you guys to comment and ask questions. Even share your screen if you have some problem you'd like to discuss.
And I put the PDF in the chat and it doesn't seem to be working. You have to use your box credentials to log in. So sorry, that's a pain. I'll figure out a better way to do that. But we'd also love to see your faces. So don't be shy, turn your cameras on if you can. And yeah. If you see anybody else on this call that you know and you want to talk about some stuff, that's fine too.
Well, I'll jump in with a question. It's not wildlife related, but I've been working on a project. Can you hear me okay? Am I loud enough?
Yeah, maybe lean in a little bit, Sam. And also, it'd be awesome if you could tell us where you're tuning in from and what's your professional title. That'd just be great to know.
Okay, good point. So I'm a remote sensing specialist with the Bureau of Land Management in Cheyenne, Wyoming. And one of the projects I'm working on right now is the forester up in the northeast part of the state would like a kind of a forest canopy map currently and then historically to see where fire and insect damage have reduced the forest canopy and where they might look at trying to restore to historical forest areas. And so I've been using nape imagery to classify conifers in particular. And one of the questions that I had, and one of the reasons I tuned in, I wanted to learn some more about this, is does the LANDFIRE exist in discrete sets by time period? So for example, could I look at LANDFIRE as it was, 4, 5, 6 years ago and compare that to the current version of LANDFIRE? I mean, I'm not real clear on how many iterations of LANDFIRE there's been, but I understand there's been at least a couple. So is it something that I could look at change over time based on the available data sets?
All right, so I've got some thoughts on that, but I wanted to just open the floor in case other people, especially outside of our team, have thoughts on this if you've done this sort of thing before.
I'm quite curious to hear what you have to say, Randy. We have used some of your different time slices. If memory serves, they're sort of like roughly every 4 or 5 years sort of thing. But I have a similar question to Sam in whether or not you guys are maybe going to go kind of the same route that, like Brady and the RAP, the rangeland analysis platform folks have gone, and applying any of your stuff to that higher temporal frequency that the Landsat's available at. I know there's a whole lot more curation and effort that goes into what you guys are doing. So, yeah, so I'm equally curious to Sam. But
all right, well,
use that.
I'll take on. Sam. I'll try to give a crack at your question in a general way. Then maybe I'll turn over to Jim Smith or Henry Bastian to talk about the tag-on question from Joe. Yeah, there are several versions of LANDFIRE data. So theoretically, you could do that. You could, look for change over time. There are some cautions with that. It's like this balance. We want to be consistent so that people can explore these sorts of questions, but we also improve. Methods do change. And so there can be some, kind of false positives or false change that you see because of methodological shifts. Also, I wanted to just flag something. So those versions in the past where you might think of them as LANDFIRE refresh data sets. So there was like a base data set, it'd be like your 1999 Toyota Corolla. Then every 2 years you refresh it, you clean it, you do a major maintenance on it. Then recently we delivered LANDFIRE remap data, which would be like getting a whole new Corolla. You can't fix that thing up anymore, so you go get a new Corolla. And there were, it was a major improvement in my mind in methods. And then the data set is also delivered in a different way. The bins for cover and height, for example, are different. So you just have to be aware of that. So that's sort of a general answer. Then I thought I would turn it over to other folks to dig into more specifics on that. But it's a great question. Great question, Sam and Joe.
So I guess I'll jump in, Randy, since you mentioned my name. And then if somebody else wants to jump in, that would be fine too. So I think Randy pointed out the important things. 01 is an original data set representing conditions in 01. Then you have 8, 10, 12, and 14, which are updates only in areas of disturbance. So you would not find differences in canopy cover in areas that were not disturbed in 8, 10, 12, and 14, okay? In 16, there could be, the whole area was mapped wall to wall, every pixel, so it doesn't matter whether it was disturbed or not. And then the other change he mentioned was before the latest remap, cover was provided in 10% classes. But in the last version, 2016 remap, it was delivered as 1% categories. So comparing them does have some confusion because of the change in the thematic content, okay? As well as some differences in methodology. The differences in methodology are probably smaller for canopy cover than they would be for some of the others, but there are some, okay? So that is important for you to remember when you go to compare. We are developing a version comparison document to help people and guide people comparing vegetation conditions. That is existing vegetation cover, height, and type across different versions. That document should be coming out pretty soon to provide guidance on that, okay? As far as the plans in the future, Joe, are to deliver data more frequently with less latency. So as an example, to deliver 2021 data in the spring of 2022. Okay, so it would be less latent and more frequent. So that is a plan, but it would not be, for instance, what might be called LC map or the continuous change detection work that goes on at Arrows, where they update every time a new image comes in and they actually regenerate products. We will not be doing that, but we hope to use their data. But still on an episodic basis annually as it stands right now. We do not have a plan to deliver as soon as, for instance, new images become available. That's possible in the future, but not probably for the next, I would say, 3 or 4 or 5 years. But we will be going to an annual delivery. In fact, we're going to deliver 2019L in the next few months. Notice the name 2019L, okay? So that even though it's 2021, we're going to be 2 years behind. But next year, we hope to be 1 year behind. Did that answer your question, Joe? And if somebody has a correction, please jump in and correct me.
That's super helpful. Just a clarification on that 2008, 10, 12 is disturbed only burned, or is that a broader?
Any disturbance that was sent to us or was a part of a national database or that we detected using remote sensing change detection techniques. Okay. So we found our own disturbances, anything that changed the vegetation cover, the overall dominant cover, we tried to identify it, as well as a causality and a severity. That's tricky, but it was not just burns, any disturbance in the vegetation pattern.
Is there good documentation we can refer to on that? I mean, that's pretty neat that you guys, so I didn't realize that was the case.
Those disturbance layers are available for you to download. So we have annual disturbance layers for years, Joe, that you can download. And then there's metadata associated with each one of those layers. And then we also combine them into a sort of a combined disturbance as well as the annual. So you'll find that under the disturbance data bin in LANDFIRE for you to download. So you'll see them annual. I mean, starting at, I think in 99, either 99 or 2000, you'll find this individual annual disturbance layers. Like I said, they have causality, severity, and of course, if they're annual, we know what year they happen. Okay. Did that help, Joe?
That's hugely helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
The only thing that I will add, I think Jim and Randy, you guys covered this really well, is Jim mentioned 2 documents that are going to be coming out. One is going to talk about comparing products, versions over time. So that's going to be coming out. I'm not going to say it's the holy grail and give you all of the details, but it's going to at least give you some insight and then go through the various versions and highlight some key distinctions relative to the vegetation. And then the second document is on this LANDFIRE 2019 limited effort, because we realize, I'm with you. I'm the first to say this. Jim is with me on this too. We're just like, we need to get out ahead of this and let people know it's coming and what is it, So that document is also coming out. There will be actually 2 parts. One will be a longer detailed document that goes into a little bit more of kind of a question answer format. And then the second will just be a 1-page summary, so that if you just want to share it with some friends quickly to say, what are the high points? Okay, what does that mean? We'll have that out too. and that's coming soon.
If you
And
want
if
to quit, go ahead, Jim.
I was just going to say, for people who are interested, we talk about methodological changes. There were some major advances in mapping technologies between '04 when we started and 2019 or 20, you know, today. So that does have an impact on the data set. You do have to remember that. Particularly, I would tell you for existing vegetation height, where we had no LiDAR data when we originally started. And now we have a lot of LiDAR data to support height mapping, which allowed us to actually, again, provide data in 1 meter bins for trees and in 10th meter bins for shrubs and grasses. Okay, so you do have to be mindful of those methodological changes. The field's advanced tremendously over the past 20 years or so since we've been doing this.
So I wanted to call everyone's attention to Sean's point in the chat. Sean, thank you for that. I'm going to open the floor for this one for sure. I am not a fuel specialist, and I think other people, you know, might be interested in that or have ideas for you.
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes,
Sean, do you
yes,
want to
Sean,
unmute yourself and
Sorry,
tell
I'm
us?
kind of getting my speaker set up. You can hear me fine?
Yes, beautiful.
Okay, cool. So anyway, I've been thinking about that sequencing too, and I actually put it in effect because I was doing evaluation and analysis for the Martin Fire. There's a couple of years ago. It burned over 400,000 in northern acres in northern Nevada, and I wasn't getting good intel exactly what was going on. The one report was the fire was doing what it was doing because of dead stands of sagebrush. In the 90s, the area, much of the area had been impacted by a roga moth, which caused mortality. Then I had other reports that it was an actual increase of invasive annual grass for that season or the consecutive seasons. And so the spatial data was a key piece of helping put that together, because it kind of had two different ideas on what was driving this fire: dead sagebrush and invasive annual grass. And part of it is this thing was really hard to catch. It moved fast, and on the east it finally got caught because it ran into an ESR treatment where they had greener fuels. And then subsequently, a few months later, another fire started and burned another 145,000 acres. So it's basically for that year, it was about 80 to 100 miles of west-east blackened area in northern Nevada. So anyway, what I did is I took, and I knew something about the differences, but at that scale and that level, because we're really zoomed out at 400,000+ acres on what's going on. And so I was able to sequence the different LANDFIRE years, and then included that year's provisional data, the MoD-FIS. And that helped kind of tell that story, because you could see those previous disturbances, mostly the fires, show up in the subsequent layers in the foul behavior fuel model. They're transitioning quite often to in the model to a grass model usually, but it's almost like a south to north march of this change across the landscape over this time period. I used other tools like range land analysis platform, fuel loading data that the districts had collected, as well as fuel moisture stuff to help calibrate. But looking at LANDFIRE sequence at that scale, I think was pretty helpful. And I could see the change, and we've got a working hypothesis now that suggests that this problem, because it seemed to emerge coming from the south, may be moving to the north, and we're concerned that some of those large-scale fires that we're seeing, like in southeast Oregon and southern Oregon, that there's a band in there that's less frequent fire, and we think if the trends continue, that'll be a pretty solid continuum. It'll be a change from less frequent fires to more frequent fires and more large fires in its by latitude. So it's kind of been interesting. It's hypothetical, but you could see the transition occurring through time in that.
Thanks, John. That's cool.
And Sean, I will point out that one of the areas that's in need of improvement in LANDFIRE and everywhere is invasive species. It's really hard to map from satellites, from imagery. The field data to drive that mapping is highly variable and sporadic and just in every bad way that you can think. But that's something that I think there's probably a bigger effort at the federal level, and Henry can probably chime in on it, to really start to think about invasive, not just grasses, but invasive species in general, and how we can do a better job of that and incorporating that into products like LANDFIRE.
Maybe just the little bit that I'll say, and Sean, I think you're spot on. There's a contributing a number of effects going on there that you're talking about. And so relative to the invasives, Jim's right. We are looking at it. LANDFIRE has a little bit, definitely not all that it should. There is an effort going right now with the Wildland Leadership Council and the National Invasive Species Council. They are collaborating together on a joint effort to see where we can do a better job of coordinating and collaborating. That runs the gamut from data to research to operations, all of those things. But the key thing that I'm looking at is the data relationships, like Jim was talking about, is how can we leverage what data we do have, because sometimes we just we're not connecting databases like we need to make a better informed decision. So we leverage that can then feed into things like we're doing with, say, MoD-FIS, our modeling dynamic fuels with an index system, so that we can pick up on that seasonality that you're talking about. And then coordinating with researchers like Matt Reeves, he's doing stuff, with fuel casting, another, variant like that, but it's leveraging what's happening in that, let's say, Great Basin and how, that country is transitioning. So I think we've got to just, keep coordinating, collaborating, and, see where we can kind of connect those dots and those opportunities, because that landscape is changing fast, not just because of fire, but a number of other factors.
Yeah, it's interesting with the MoD-FIS. I've tested it a little bit against, so we do annual fuel load rangeland sampling of our fuels, just to do comparative, and it's been pretty good. And then another reason I like it is because you're looking at cover, and with fine fuels in particular, it's really important to look at continuity, especially in rangeland fuels, or desert and range perennial shrubs, grasses tend to be somewhat discontinuous. Perennial bush grasses in particular, they're clumpy, whereas a lot of invasive annual grass is continuous. And so and the other thing I think going for us in the Mojave is there's less biomass overall, so there's a little bit better signal there for us to track that. But anyway, the good news is that the on-the-ground sampling appears to be matching up with the modeled MoD-FIS data.
Yeah, we're excited with that product. And we're hearing not only comments like you just made, Sean, others are saying the same thing, realizing that it still needs to innovate and improve, kind of some of the other things we talked about earlier on this call. And the limitation right now is MoD-FIS is only in the southeast and the southwest, to I'll say the largest extent. So the master plan is to extend that and think about what's going on in Alaska. Oh my gosh, depending upon their year, some of that seasonality can have a big effect, and we're just not doing anything there yet. So we have got to expand that, concept across other lands.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I think the fire spread model itself is very sensitive to surface area to volume, which is driven by fine fuels, but we haven't really been able to capture that as well as others.
Yeah, very good. Good points, and I'm glad you threw that in the chat. It's a nice, nice topic to talk a little bit about.
Okay, I've got a question, if I may. That's, I guess, somehow.
Wait, Mohammed, tell us. We recognize you from last month, but tell us about where you're from and what you're studying.
Sure. Sorry about that. So I'm a researcher with UCLA, and I'm working on a fuel mapping project using machine learning. So question is kind of a follow-up to what Joe said, I guess, in terms of the temporal aspect and the different versions. So you all have this different refresh versions, the 10, 12, 14, and then there's the remap, right? And then my question is about the intermediate years. So I kind of know that if you are in one of those, like you are 2018, 2017, and you have disturbance in your area, you're supposed to take that into account, obviously, right? Just want to know what the process is there. That's part one of my question. Part two is because my application is more fuels, there's this concept of capable fuels that I read on the website. I just wanted to know a little bit about that. I guess that means from like 2019 capable, my understanding from reading the documentation was from 2016, whatever disturbance that you already knew about before 2016, you're taking that into account to provide the 2019 capable, and anything else that happens in between 2016 and 2019, the user needs to take that into account. So
that's not quite right, Mohammed.
Okay. Okay.
Because the 2019 product does include disturbances that were sent to us or that we found in 2017, 18, and 19. That's why it's called 2019. Okay.
Okay.
Because include disturbances that we found. The difference is we did not go looking for disturbances in 17, 18, and 19 using satellite imagery. The time was there to do that. So the disturbances had to be submitted to us or somebody else where we could find them. So it's not all disturbances in 17, 18, 19 are included in 2019L, but some are, okay? Capable fuels, what they do is they use a technique to basically project the fuels and the vegetation condition in disturbed areas to the year of delivery. So when you look at 2019L veg and fuels, they were projected ahead to represent 2021. We're delivering in 2021, right? That would include disturbances 17, 18, 19, but not disturbances in 2020, which was a big fire here in California and Oregon, right? So those will not be included in 2019.
Sure.
So that's what the capable fuels and veg means, is they're projected ahead to be the year of delivery, not the year of the name. The year of the name represents disturbances that were included. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. Just the part one of my question is, if you are modeling something historical, some fire that happened in 2017, 2018, then you use the 2016, and you're supposed to, I mean, things have happened in between. What is the process for taking that into account, updating 2016 to the state as of the date I am interested in, which is 2018, let's say?
Do you mean what we do, Mohammed, or what?
No,
you
what
would need to do?
I think the users are supposed to, like, if they have a date in mind for their location, right? And then they know that something happened in between, and they're using 2016, right? Because you have 2016, and then the next thing is 2019, I guess, right?
Right.
I am interested in 2018, and I know that something happened in between. What is the process for me to update my data? I mean, your data to 2018.
Okay. Well, you would start with 2016 if you had a perimeter for the disturbance and a severity and a cause. Then we have rules that you can download. Those transition rules are available for download that would show you how we would have moved it and transitioned it. You know, if it was this type and this cover height, and it had this kind of severity and this kind of disturbance that occurred 2 years ago, here's what we would call it. Those rules are in an access database that you can download and look at. Now, we hope to make that more user-friendly in the future. There are hundreds of thousands of those rules, as you can imagine, right? Every combination of type, cover, and height, severity, and causality has to be handled in those rules. So it's kind of clunky, but they are there, and you could do that. You could use those rules or develop your own. You know, if it's an easy set of rules, you define your own rules.
Sure.
To say, here's the starting condition. What was the type of severity, the severity of the disturbance? What will we move it to? Because that's what we do. We use rules. In fact, I think there are millions of rules, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, there's lots of rules. I was just going to add, Mohammed, your characterization is correct relative to you as a user, because all you have available to you today is LANDFIRE 2016. So your question is very relevant, is how do I then update it based on that? 2019, okay, that's coming. Yeah, we can talk about it, but you don't have access to it yet. So it's like, yeah, you know, we'll talk about that later, but you're exactly spot on. There's a lot of change that has occurred since 2016, and we recognize that. And so that's why we're transitioning to, you know, an update strategy to get us in a point where we can do these annual updates.
Okay.
I added a link in a chat to some information where another user and I worked with the LANDFIRE Total Fuel Change Tool and MTBS data to go through this process to update for a few large fires on a landscape and data up to current for an analysis. So it's a little bit old, but it might be helpful. You could use that as a starting point and then reach back out if that's not quite covering it. This is really what you'll find in this document is just fuels, which it sounded like that's what you were working on. But, you know, there'd be something a little different if you were going to look at type or something, one of the other products.
That's really helpful, Corey. And I'll just say, you know, maybe to add to that, not only this documentation that Corey listed there that's listed through the Conservation Gateway, there are some other reports that we could point you to, Mohammed, that, you know, some other folks have similarly done. I know, like, for instance, Rick Stratton, you know, he's one of our, I'll say a star, you know, in the modeling and data, you know, update approach. And so he's gone through and documented, you know, methods, procedures, approaches on how you would go through and, you know, manage that. So there's a few things like that that we could point you to.
I'll say the other thing you could do at the same time, since you're updating your data to bring it to current, is you could review, you know, and possibly locally calibrate some of the assignments, just if you feel like you could make a better local assignment at that time.
Maybe, Corey, would you mind putting your contact information and send it to Mohammed so he could ask you a little more specifically?
Sure.
I want to recognize we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to make sure that anybody else that had questions or comments about LANDFIRE and wildlife has an opportunity to do so. Please don't be shy.
I have a little bit of a general question. I'm unfamiliar with LANDFIRE. My name's Anna. I'm a master's student at the University of Michigan School for Environment Sustainability. And I'm a little unfamiliar with LANDFIRE, so I'm just learning about it right now. But one of the things, just as you all are talking about projections of fuel and vegetation change, I'm wondering how the sort of data collection plan for future iterations of LANDFIRE is including climate, like factoring climate change into that, and is the plan going to change? And I also would love, I mean, if this is really basic for everyone else here, I can do my own research, so we can skip it. But I would also love to know more about how those projections of, you know, gathering data in 2019 so that it can be used in 2021, like how those projections are generated.
And I'll address two things very generally. First, greetings. I'm in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, so while we're 8 hours apart, it's still fun to be in the same state. In general, LANDFIRE does not map or model climate change. Our data sets are inputs to many modeling programs and tools that people do. So we would love to talk to you more about that. Then in general, I would say too, there's just no dumb question. I've been doing this for a long time, and I'm learning things today. So yeah, make sure you reach out with questions, and I'll let other people dig more into the sort of the how the projections are done, like Jim sort of was mentioning earlier.
Yeah, and I'll just clarify about the climate change question. I meant more because vegetation zones ecosystems will be shifting and changing so much. I'm wondering how that maybe factors into the plan of generating new iterations of LANDFIRE data sets. Like, is it going to be more frequent data collection, or, how do you sort of keep up with potentially rapidly changing ecosystems? Just to clarify my question, but yeah.
Maybe just add a little bit more to what Randy said, and super question. He's exactly right. We're not accounting for that by and large. We do incorporate what are called some essential climate variable data that the U.S. Geological Survey produces out of the Rocky Mountain area. Todd Hawbaker in particular is the lead on that. And so to the extent we can, pull some of that data and information in to help inform some of the products, we are looking at that, but it's not a strong relationship and correlation to like what Jim was talking about before of, thinking about a capable fuel situation and accounting for, carbon and climate. We're not even touching that at this, point in time. So it's definitely on the cusp. And if there's, folks like you, grad students, researchers that are, interested in doing something like that, we'd be interested in, future collaboration to try to figure out how might, someone potentially approach that. Realizing that you'd have to start local and then trying to scale that regionally, nationally sometimes can be challenging.
And I'll follow up and say, we don't really collect data. We grab other people's data, FIA, NRCS, BLM, researchers, academia, project. So we don't have a data collection plan, except we'll take anything you will give us. That's our data collection plan, okay? But I think what climate change is going to do is impact what people expect of us in the future and what they expect of us to provide, like invasive annual grasses or whatever. Climate change is going to impact things like frequency, latency. Some of the products perhaps might have to be different in the future than they are now. But as far as data collection, we're not even really doing that as a program. And when I talked about projections, that's a really pompous word for what we do, okay? We're not using, some kind of great simulator or estimation. We're just basically have rules that say, if a disturbance happened in 2017, in 2021, that would be 4 years since the disturbance. So we try to project what the veg or fuel conditions would be 4 years after the disturbance. It's really just a rule, okay? So to call what we do a projection is a bit much. It's not really accurate in the same sense as like a simulation model like Landis or something else that's trying to project into the future. And since our data is current or past, we're trying to operate under the current climate, not what we think it might be in the future.
Yeah, just to maybe add a little bit more to that. So there is what is called the Forest Vegetation Simulator, if you're familiar with that, FVS. And then there's also a Rangeland Vegetation Simulator, RVS. And those we have leveraged to, I'll say a certain degree to help with these projections as Jim's talking about. But because it's not, all lands, all veg types, all that stuff, we can only leverage it to the extent that it's available. And so it informs pieces. And that's why the rules that Jim's talking about, we've got to have something that is, comprehensive and consistent for everything. And so kind of that lowest common denominator, which is sometimes the dummy it down, that let's use the dummy, manual for dummies. We got to start there while these other simulation and projection, models get to a state and a point where they, incorporate that particular, cover type, for instance. And there's a lot of good things happening, but it's just not there universally across all lands yet.
And as Randy said, Anna, reach out to us. We'll try to help you. Any of us you see to try to help you bring you up to speed. But if you're not familiar with the product suite and the version, that information is quite extensive on the landfire.gov website. You can see what's been delivered in what version over the years. So you can really delve into it there. But bring us questions. We'd be glad to help you.
Thank you. I really appreciate the responses from everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. We have Joe. Joe brings up a really great point about nationwide LiDAR and 3-depth. And again, I'd have to turn that over to others to address that in terms of plans. I'm not on the planning side of this, so I'll turn it over to others to address that.
Well, I know that we're aware of those things, Joe, because the people at Aeros are the ones that do a lot of the mapping for LANDFIRE, the USGS, if not basically all the mapping. But I know that that's considered to be very important innovation to incorporate as much LiDAR data as possible, 3-depth as, LiDAR data. But if we, it's going to be a little bit harder in the future because I don't know when we're going to do a remap, quote unquote. We're going to be updating again for a while, which means, we'll be focusing on areas of change and growth, not re-estimation necessarily of height, but we actually hope to try to maybe factor in some ways to update data to remap data more frequently, maybe on a rolling basis geographically, where things like a base LiDAR set could be rolled in on a continuous pattern, but we don't have that yet. And Joe, did Randy's answer your question about data access? Was that you, Joe?
Yeah, I actually didn't know some of those other. I'd been doing some things a dumber way, and we downloaded everything we thought you had, and then it looks like you've got something that. So I got to play with it and break it first.
Okay. So. And something that's coming in the future is something called a landscape service. The availability of that will be, and who will be able to get to it, but to basically create this cloud-based landscape service. Again, I don't know exactly when that'll be available or who would have access to it, but that's, again, sort of a different version of a streaming service. I want to call it that. It's a little bit different. Henry probably knows more about that than I.
Yeah, that kind of fits within what we have currently with the REST and the web coverage services. We're actually changing the title from landscape because it's based off of the LCP, which is a landscape file that's needed to run, for instance, like in Farsight or FlyMap, type applications. So we're going to just call it a LANDFIRE product service, but knowing that people are going to data services, instead of you downloading a copy and having it, on your machine, doesn't make sense because, what happens if there's updates and, all that kind of stuff. So we just want to create the service so that then people can just hit it for their, area, pull in what data layers they're interested in. There are questions, of course, about costs of, how much and, all those kinds of things that we are grappling through right now. My vision is let's make it available to everybody and we'll figure that out. But we're going to have to start small. So we'll start with, some of our core applications right now within LANDFIRE, of course, WFDS, the LANDFIRE Decision Support System. They are keenly interested in having that service because they don't want to have to host it. The Interagency Fuel Treatment Decision Support System, another one, we'll set up a service with them. So we'll start those handshakes and then we'll see where we go. Because to Anna's, comment about carbon, climate, I can see, having those data services available in that arena could be really helpful.